that leads us directly into our main topic here on Mastering Dungeons this week, which is Chapter 9 of the 5e Player's Handbook. As we have said, it's been about 10 years since the release of that very first playtest packet of D&D Next, 8 years since the release of the initial starter set, and we want to look at how it's been going in these intervening years, what we've learned, and what we might expect going forward. So let's dig into game design. Chapter 9, Combat. So the first thing we get is a description of the order of combat. And not surprisingly, the first thing that you do is you determine surprise. Is either side surprised? Then you establish the positions of all of the creatures and everything else that's involved in the combat. You roll initiative. Then you each get your turn in the initiative order, and then you begin the next round. Any thoughts on that? Anything different from previous editions, or anything you would like to change?
I mean, there's so many things that have changed across the editions around just these topics, but surprise is an interesting one because there have been editions that did things like say there is a surprise round. Do we need to use it in this particular combat? And here what 5th edition does is to say the first round of combat, you may be surprised and may not act. And one of the questions that comes up is to what extent you should remain surprised. There's sort of a lack of clarity around should you remain surprised. You know, say you set up an ambush and you start attacking. At some point, do you cease to be surprised? Right? Is there anything that changes that? And I think can be unclear for a lot of DMs. But the intention seems to be that you determine this for the first round and play it through the entire of the first round, and you do things like, well, you skip your turn essentially when you're surprised, and you don't get to use reactions until your turn has ended. So you might be first in the order of initiative, you do nothing, but now you have the ability to take reactions because you have had your first round already. So there's some things like that that are sort of surprising in how they play and can require thinking through it that I think could be maybe clearer. I mean, I kind of actually like the surprise round. I know why they don't want it. They don't want to label a thing as a sort of totally different thing, but the surprise round kind of almost has a clarity to it that makes it easier for new DMs, I think.
Okay. Yeah, if you do change it to there being a surprise round, that gives you a point of game mechanical differentiation that you could play with for certain things. Feats or class abilities while you're in a surprise round, or when you act in a surprise round, you can do these sorts of things, which of course adds complication to the game, but also gives game designers an avenue to introduce new rules, new abilities. So that's one thing. I thought it was interesting that it was specified if neither side attempts to be stealthy, then both are aware of each other. So, you know, it's trying to say how surprise can be, but I can think of times when you are not trying to be stealthy, but you may be able to surprise someone.
Yeah. And I think older editions were more like that, right? Sort of the idea that you come around the corner, were you ready for each other was sort of more the AD&D style of play, right?
Right. Yeah. And of course, if you are surprised, you can't move or take an action on the first turn, but you can take reactions until that turn ends. Or you can't until you can't take reaction until that turn ends when it's your turn. Anything else about surprise?
Surprise, I think, has been bigger in other editions. Like I think of especially 3rd edition, where monsters could really, really unleash some pain on you. And so being surprised could almost mean character death, right? It was something players really feared. And so they worked hard to counter surprise. And it's interesting to note that in 5th edition, that tends to not be such a huge problem. I mean, you don't want to lose your turn, but you're not expecting to die as a result of it. And so that's a big difference.
Another thing that's made a huge difference is the group checks. Because if you are doing a group stealth check, it's not, well, 5 of us succeeded, but cleric or paladin over there with disadvantage and an 8 dexterity let everyone know that we were sneaking up on them. Group checks allow for better stealth rolls, which then allows for more surprise, particularly on the player character side of the equation.
Yeah. Yeah. Good point.
Then we get into initiative. Initiative is, of course, the DM making a roll for an entire group of identical characters according to the rules. So each member of the group acts at that same time. And then initiative is a dexterity check, and thus it is affected by anything that modifies dexterity ability checks, although it is not a skill.
Mm-hmm.
So the bards, for example, have the jack of all trades ability that allows them to add half their proficiency bonus to all skill checks. And since this initiative is a skill check, they can add their half of their initiative bonus to their initiative.
One interesting change is in fifth edition, you no longer have the compare your dexterity modifier, which was in fourth and third, and maybe some previous ones to break a tie. So if two characters, two creatures have the same bonus or same result on the roll, they the DM can determine if it's two monsters who should go first. The players can determine if they're there. So it's basically just make a decision. And if you want to, optionally, you can roll dice to have a roll off, but you don't actually look up the modifier, which is something that a lot of people miss. Just to streamline play.
Should initiative be a skill?
No, I don't think you want people putting points into it or becoming proficient in it. I think that ends up being a little too much. And I don't even know that Jack of all trades really should affect it, but
Is it ever a good idea to have initiative determined by something other than the dexterity skill check?
On the monster side, I like it. Like I like things where monsters act, say on their initiative and on 20. Right, things like that can be cool. Or initiative plus 10. Right, sometimes you see monsters that have that kind of design.
Yeah.
I'd rather like that because it spaces things out. I don't know. What do you think?
Well, I'm thinking of situations where you are talking to what you think are the guards, and you're parlaying with them, and then you realize that they're not really guards, who you were hired to find. And so an insight check might be more appropriate to realize that this thing that you're about to do,
Yeah.
you act quicker when you realize that this is an ambush or they're trying to fool you.
That's
That
interesting.
and by making initiative a skill, then you could put it with different, right? Put it with different intelligence check to realize that the bubbling water means that gators are about to come out.
Yeah.
Just
Huh.
it's something that I've always toyed with when I think about game design, but in D&D it's always been sort of dexterity based, so we just leave it as
Right.
dexterity based.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Yep. And then in order of combat, we get your turn. What can you do on your turn? Well, you can move. You can take one action, and you can take a bonus action. And reactions, you can take any time as long as they are triggered by something specific. And they refresh at the start of your turn. And you can do reactions once per round. And you can also interact with an object once at the DM's discretion. Whew.
Yeah.
So I got winded just talking about it. Is that too much? Is that just right? What's our thought on that in D&D?
I think it's okay. It's fine. I think in the fifth edition player's handbook, in that generally what you're doing is you're moving and taking an action, and the reaction only comes up every now and then, and the bonus action comes up sometimes based on your class. And you're going to get good enough at doing that thing that is your class feature that does that, like the rogues with their cunning action, that you're going to know how to do that and you're going to do it pretty well. So I think in general it works well. in the 5th edition Player's Handbook. Since then, we've seen more and more bonus actions, reactions, even no action things, things you track, things that, and Tasha's is full of this. And that requires so much work that then this is, I think, too much. So I think it depends on what else the system is doing. I think this is fine when there's more around this, or when the bonus action is a menu of choices, as it was for minor actions in 4th edition or quicken actions in 3rd edition. Then you get too much load on the system, right? And the action economy becomes this big thing that characters and players are trying to exploit.
Mhm. Yeah, I've I've having played previous editions without things like a bonus action, where it's just you move and then you do the thing.
Mm-hmm.
No bonus actions, no reactions, nothing like that. Um, and then thinking of games where there's even more complicated, more steps in the actions economy, and more choices within each step of this economy. And I'm always curious about the right mix of complication for the wide variety of players that we want to have playing the game, and what is best.
One thing that D&D has often done, especially 2nd edition on, is to codify it so in such a way, right? So codified that players really play that way. And it's interesting when you play a game that isn't that way. So like Legend of the Five Rings has a thing where you can get flanking, right? We're all familiar with
Mhm.
that. In my time playing across many, many DMs, I would always be able to get flanking. It didn't matter how many people were around that creature already. It didn't matter how far away that person was. Can I get flanking that guy? Sure. Like it was basically, if you just ask for flanking, you get flanking. And it was so funny coming from a D&D mindset where the answer was many times no, there's no more space around them, or you can only move your water, so no, you can't get there. It was really fascinating. The players just like, I don't care. Our DMs were just, I don't care. Yeah, sure, just go for it. Like, do your thing. And can I do this, interact with this object, and then with that object and this thing, right? Like we see Chris Perkins in the Ack Inc. Games with Viari, right? Viari is
Yeah.
like, can I swing from the chandelier? Can I climb up
Right.
the Triceratops? Can I also do this thing? And everybody just starts laughing because Perkins would just say yes to whatever Viari would come up with, right?
Right. Right. And if the game is more fun that way, then why don't we put it in the
Right.
rules? After watching several Ack Inc. games, I would look to the person to my right or left and say, you know what? That would be a fun game to play,
Mm-hmm.
because it's not D&D, but it would be a fun game to try. And so it's questions like that which beg the question, why aren't we seeing that in the next edition of the game, if that's
Yeah.
how people are playing the game anyway?
Yeah, and we'll talk about this when we get to
Interesting to think
actions.
about.
Yeah, actions in combat, because actions in combat is one of those things that we see it get more and more codified. When I think actually the benefit of 5e has been that it's been codified enough to create a common language, but open enough to encourage neat ideas. And I've been very
Mhm.
impressed with 5th edition, how new players, you just give them their character sheet, you explain to them the basics, and they start coming up with really cool concepts. So the character sheet does not inhibit their desire to do wild, neat things. There have been previous editions, like 3rd and even 4th, where it all feels so codified that they just can't imagine doing something other than what the character sheet possesses, right? And I think it's
Mhm.
becoming more that way. Like if you start really saying to people, the interact with a monster, or what would influence a monster action. Do you want to take it's like this menu of options, in the Terminator's brain.
Mhm.
It's either an option
Right.
or it isn't, right? Because of the way people start treating it.
Do we need to add a do a cool thing action to 6E?
I take
It's
a
an
VR
action, you do
action.
a cool thing. Yes, exactly. All right, so that's the basics of a combat round.
Yeah,
Now
can
we're
I
going to talk about
say
movement and position. We Yeah.
the I do think that this section is really well written. Like I love the intro paragraph to combat. I like all of this is very clean. Like I think there's a very meticulous approach to this section that reads really well and I think is very clear. And that part I really love about this.
Mhm. Yeah. I think it did. I think one of the reasons why 5e was such a success is that it took the right approach to this. It explained it well,
Hmm.
and it eliminated the worst faults of previous editions by being too much,
Hmm.
but got in just enough that it did allow people to understand it with some explanation. So I think that was good. So with movement position, we hear about breaking up your move. So if you try to use more than one method of movement, flying, swimming, walking, climbing, you subtract the distance that you've already moved from your new speed, and if it gets to 0 or less, you can't move any further.
Hmm.
Um, and I thought I've had people try to explain it to me, and it was confusing. And then when I read this, I was like, oh, that makes perfect sense.
Hmm.
Uh, however far you've moved, you subtract it from whatever movement you're trying to do, that mode, and if it's 0 or less, you stopped.
Yep.
We hear about difficult terrain, which means you have to spend an extra foot of movement for each foot you've moved within that terrain. One thing I've noticed is, I think it was in 4th edition, they had challenging and damaging terrain,
Yeah.
where challenging terrain was you had to uh, make a check in order to be able to move within that terrain. And damaging terrain was obviously for each 5 feet you move, you take a certain amount of damage. And I would have loved to have that in there. It may be in the Dungeon Master's Guide for all I know, but I would have loved to have it here just to get
Yeah.
players to start thinking about this in terms of uh, other ways that your character may be challenged rather
By
than just
terrain.
have it
Yeah.
be a monster in front of you.
Yep.
Yeah. We learn about being prone and understand that it costs half your movement to stand when you are prone, which was different than previous editions where it would either be like a set amount of movement you would have to spend to stand, or you'd have to spend your whole movement to stand, which made it problematic then. If somebody could move 60 or somebody can move 10, it costs the same amount for you to stand from prone.
I think that's one of those that it's
We
easy to oversee kind of how good this decision actually turned out to be. Like half your movement is enough of a penalty to limit you somewhat, but it doesn't, end you and often won't be a big factor. And that's actually probably pretty good. Like this is one of these that it's hard to really see how good this is because essentially what it does is just work fine in the background.
Yeah, for sure. Moving around or through other creatures. Any creatures, even allies, their spaces count as difficult terrain if you try to move through an allied square, or you can't move through an enemy square unless the size difference allows that, and that might allow normal movement if the creature doing the moving is tiny or at least 2 sizes smaller than the square that they're moving through.
Yeah,
Flying movement, if you're
I was gonna say I'm on record for not loving that because of the situation where you're in a small corridor, especially a 5 foot corridor, but even in a 10 foot wide corridor, and you're in marching order, and you have to go through. You're in the rear ranks, and you have to go to through 3 or 4 characters. Uh, that's you know a lot of movement
yeah.
that just gets sucked up, and you can end up, especially a 5 foot corridor, you can end up in a situation where nobody's moving around. It's terrible. I just think you should be able to let allies through your square and just not have be difficult.
Mhm.
I don't think there's much gained tactically by counting that extra foot for that, but so be it.
Yeah. I can't argue with that. I think it helps. I think it's a problem that can be fixed with encounter design, but is it a problem that should need to be fixed with encounter design? It's a good question.
Hmm.
Uh, Flying movement, if you're knocked prone while flying, you fall unless your movement is magical, or if you have the hover rider to your flight. We learn about creature size, which of course is, I'm trying to do it from memory here. Is it tiny, small, medium, large, huge, gargantuan?
Yep. And
Sound
and the
right?
The only real change here is that they got rid of colossal. So it used to be a colossal
Right.
category, and now your maximum sizes is 20 by 20 or larger, just as all gargantuan. That's fine.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yep. Then we get to the meat of the chapter, which is actions in combat. We are told by the rules that a round is 6 seconds. So don't make things that don't take any time, such as remembering something, looking at something, or saying something as an action. That was my uh,
Mm-hmm.
editorial analysis there. Right. If it's something that's instantaneous, it doesn't take any time at all. Don't make it an action or a bonus action. Um, and similarly, don't allow something that goes on for much longer than 6 seconds be only an action, like, reciting this epic poem that would normally take you a minute and a half to be done in a round.
Yeah.
You want to lead us here through a little bit of
Yeah.
this actions in combat?
Sure. And I'm going to go back just 1 second to before this section. There's a little sidebar that says variant of playing on a grid. And none of it's really particularly interesting. I think it's all very, you can use squares instead of 5 feet increments. But one thing that's interesting, it talks about range, and you can just start adjacent to one square, sort of representing, like, say, an arrow you're firing. So it's adjacent to your square. And then the shortest number of squares between you and the square that the target is. And that's your range. And you can do the shortest way to count that out, and that's great. But one of the things it doesn't do, and there are a couple of sections that almost talk about this but don't really, is when you have a sort of a triangular situation where you have a creature that's flying, and you want to know what is the distance, and diagonally to it, and there's nothing that really tells you how to quickly measure that. If you have no, like, you have no combat in, you have no squares to count because the thing is hovering, right? It's not on a map. It's not lateral movement. It's height wise. And previous editions would say some things like, take the, I think it was the longest of the sides or something like that. I forget. There were some shortcuts, and here there's no rule that really covers that. I think that probably is, even though it's a small corner case, is probably worth addressing. Um,
Should they be teaching us the Pythagorean theorem?
That is the best way. A squared plus b squared equals c squared is probably what everybody should be doing. But but usually choosing the longest side will do fine. Um, all right, so back
Okay.
to this actions in combat. This is an interesting thing. We get attack as the most common action to take in combat. We get cast a spell, which is what spellcasters do often. We get dash, which you get to move your speed. And that's an interesting way of doing it because a lot of editions have looked at, how should you be able to move again, right? What's the language of that? And so here we get an example of how 5e codifies things. Rather than saying, hey, you could also spend your action to move, but didn't you already move? Here we say specifically, you can take the dash action and you get to move your speed, right? You gain extra movement equal to your speed. So you're moving more by using the dash action. That's an interesting way. Worth noting, there's no charge in this edition, as there was in third.
Mhm.
Disengage, so your movement doesn't provoke opportunity attacks the entire turn. Some editions have done things like, the first square you left, or one threatened square you could ignore. This is just no opportunity attacks. You're being careful disengaging. Dodge, where this is a favorite of tanks. Until the start of your next turn, any attack roll has disadvantage if you can see the attacker, and you make dexterity saving throws with advantage. And that is something that's used often to kind of sit there and tank and inhibit a creature that wants to attack the one highly armored individual. Very effective. Help, also another very powerful thing. In the D&D 5th edition, you don't have to be proficient at the thing you're trying to help with. You can help to give advantage on the next ability check to perform the task you're helping with. And alternately, you can be within 5 feet of a creature and give advantage on an attack for an ally. And so if your ally attacks the target before your next turn, they get advantage on their first attack roll. You
Yep.
can hide.
The thing
Yeah.
about help that I wanted to mention was the rules specifically say for that first part where the creature gains advantage on an ability check, it's only helpable until the start of
Hmm.
your next turn.
Yeah.
So for things like give me a survival check to to search this forest for the outlaws, technically you're not allowed to help
Mm.
that because that's not something that's done in turns.
Yeah. Good point.
Now I've seen people allow that, but it's
Hmm.
technically not something that you should be doing.
Yeah, it exceeds the span of that. That's a good point because yeah, I've seen that too. Someone helps with a thing that's a long term thing.
Mhm.
Hide is interesting because a lot of the fifth edition player's handbook talks about hiding and doesn't really tell you all that you need to know. And you almost have to copy and paste every little piece of it to really come up with the full uh, rule set of what hiding means. And so here we just simply say make a dexterity stealth check in an attempt to hide following the rules for hiding. If you succeed, you gain certain benefits. Go see this other section. I don't love that. I think this is the section where it would have been perfect to have put all the rules.
Yeah.
But no, you have to go and
Could I
add up
could I
stuff.
could I walk you through
Yeah.
the journey of finding out all the rules for this? So, uh, it says if you read at the hide section, it says see unseen attackers and targets, which is later in the chapter. But then this section doesn't actually tell you the rules you need to hide. So where do you go? Well, if you go to chapter 7, it's under dexterity, or so you think, because it says one of the main factors in determining whether you can find a hidden creature is how well you can see the area, which might be lightly or heavily obscured, as explained in chapter 8. So then you go to chapter 8, which has the environment, light, and vision, but then it still doesn't specifically talk to you about when you can or can't hide. So you really don't, the rules never really tell you at all when, where, how you can hide. What you have to do is sort of use the negative capability of other things. Where if you go to Wood Elf, it says you could attempt to hide even when you are only lightly obscured. So that must mean, okay, otherwise, if you're lightly obscured, you cannot hide in a heavy rain or foliage or mist or other natural phenomenon. And then in Halfling, we learn you can hide even if you're obscured only by a creature that is at least one size larger than you. So that tells you that if you're not a Halfling, you can't hide, right?
Right.
It's these sort of ferreting out these cases in order to figure out where the rules say you can actually hide.
And it's a shame because the rules are basically essentially the same ones from fourth edition, but they don't establish that, and because of that, you see wildly inconsistent decisions on whether you can do things like peer around a corner and fire a crossbow at someone and be hidden. Because the fourth edition rules are pretty clear about saying, well, you have now revealed yourself when you go to shoot. So unless it's all part of one power, you're going to reveal yourself. Your movement, you're going to have to move. You're now visible. You're now not hidden. So now you take your
Mhm.
action unhidden, right?
Right.
Even though what you're trying to do is that mechanic of peering around the edge. And this never does that. And so you end up with all kinds of wild options. Um, Another
Mhm.
action is ready, and this one's fine. You are going to say what is going to trigger your reaction, and then what is the action you're going to take in response to that trigger. I'll pull the lever when the cultist steps on the trapdoor. That kind of thing is the example given there. If the goblin steps next to me, I'll move away. Um, and you can take your reaction to do this. So it also uses both your action to take the ready action, and then your reaction when you do it. Um, you can also ready a spell, and then that's when the reaction takes place and the trigger occurs. The spell must have a casting time of one action, and you must concentrate. And that's an interesting thing that people sometimes forget. So if your concentration is broken, the spell dissipates without taking effect.
Mhm.
Um, that I think this is all fine. It's a little bit finicky, in terms of these little, the fine print of it, but I'm not too concerned about it. What's interesting to me is there is no delay. And you saw
Mhm.
that a lot when fifth edition first came out, where people would want to do what in fourth and I think third as well was delay, where
Mhm.
you can change, sort of go later in the turn. So I don't really
Mhm.
want to go yet. I want to go later. And you'll still hear people say like, "I'm going to delay," and it's like, well, no, that doesn't really
No.
exist. What's
Yeah.
you've got to ready if you want to do something like that.
Right. And what I thought was interesting is the rules specifically say that the trigger for your reaction must be a perceivable circumstance. Because a lot of times what you'll see, especially advanced players doing, is trying to use a reaction based on a game mechanical thing rather than an in-world narrative thing,
Mm.
right? I will wait until the monster uses their hold person spell, and then I will, well, how do you know that they're casting hold person? Right. Or I will wait until they do this thing that is a game mechanic that is not something that our characters would know or see. And that is specifically not allowed as a
Hmm.
perceivable circumstance. Um, so I just thought that was sort of funny that they bolded that thing, perceivable circumstance.
And I think that this is a good example where the rules try to walk you through it in as simply and clearly a way as possible. First, you decide what perceivable circumstances will trigger your reaction. Then you choose the action. So it tries to help you without doing a lot of coaching around it, right? So it doesn't speak to the DM, which makes sense because this is the player's handbook, to talk about how to adjudicate it, and so it tries to use language to direct the play, but because of that, it may not always cover all cases and may leave the DM and the players with some confusion, and that's just sort of the style of how this is written, which I don't necessarily object to, but it's interesting to note.
Mhm. Yeah, I thought that the next one was also interesting, which is search.
Mm-hmm.
Because search can have, I mean, it says when you take the search action, you devote your attention to finding something. Depending on the nature of your search, the DM might have you make a wisdom perception check or an intelligence investigation check. And in previous editions, search had a much more narrow definition. It would be like you must spend an action and you, in a 5 foot area, right,
Mm-hmm.
comb through it to find anything that's hidden or that's interesting.
Yeah.
And this is much less defined. It's right. You could search something right in front of you. You could use search to search the distant horizon and
Yeah.
and everything in between. So this has always been something that as an adventure designer or editor, I've always seen, right? Sometimes people will write in their adventure as an action. They must use their action to search the control panel to find the button that they need to turn off the trap. Uh, and then in other things, it's like it's just a free thing that you can do from across the room. Sometimes you have to be in a certain position to do it. It's very nebulous, and I'm not sure that that's bad. It may be a good thing that it's that nebulous that DMs can change it to mean different things at different times. But personally, this is where I love passive perception.
Hmm.
I I I don't want to use it as so much like to find hidden things as people travel, but I love to use it when there's information that I want to give the party, and so I will look at the passive perception of the characters so that if someone has a very high passive perception or the highest passive perception among the characters at the table, they're the ones that see it and it doesn't take an action to do it.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. And it's a nice way to get through not tying up actions and just saying you see it or you don't. Um,
Mhm.
and then if you want to, you could actively spend an action to do it. And this is a good example of where one D&D now is codifying actions more. At least currently it feels that way when you read the glossary. And I think a good question is when we see this final chapter, will this feel so incredibly codified to where it feels like that menu of actions that you're reviewing, right? Will you see players
Mhm.
kind of look at the character sheet and written out, will the actions be on there, and you kind of think of what to do on a particular turn? The more that it works that way, the worse it is. So, like, I think fifth edition does really
Mhm.
well by having search here as an action. But I think if you asked a lot of GMs and players, name the actions the different types of actions in 5e, they wouldn't necessarily mention these
Mhm.
because they just sort of think of it as play. And I think that's really
Right.
good that it doesn't necessarily feel like people would name dodge, disengage, and dash, maybe help. But things like hide or search, they would think of more as just things I do during play, and I just whatever it is that I think, my DM might say, well, it's going to take your action to do it, or they might not.
Mhm. Yeah. That is a good point, in terms of new players specifically, and how to get them to understand the duality of the game, in that there is a limited number of things that their characters can do in terms of the game mechanics,
Hmm.
but there is unlimited things that the characters can do in terms of the story that they're engaging with. And you want them to know you can do these things, but these things that are listed here aren't exclusive. They're inclusive of just the main things you can do, but you can technically do anything. So don't let this list limit you. And that's the balance that you need to strike.
And that's where this chapter, for example, it has a sidebar improvising an action. Your characters can do things not covered by the action of this chapter, such as breaking down doors, intimidating enemies, sensing weaknesses and magical defenses, calling for parley with a foe. The only limits are whatever, your imagination. And that's fine, but what this isn't doing, it's not intersecting directly with rules for the DM on sort of encounter design, right? So if you think about a
Mhm,
combat, and why would a combat have neat actions to take? Nothing here is prepping you for the DM doing that. Like there isn't that conversation that's
mhm,
saying, "Hey, look around at the environment in your combat.
mhm,
What can your character use? What can your character do? What neat things are here that you can utilize to your advantage or create a disadvantage for your foes?" And then it isn't going and having that conversation with the DM saying, "Hey, we've told your players to get ready for this stuff
mhm,
and make use of it." Right? This is all very clinical around these actions, and I think that D&D would be better off if we had a little bit of that in there, a little bit of this back and forth of
mhm,
combat should have interesting things. Look for them, use them, right? Look for the chandelier to swing on. Look for
mhm,
ways you can, jump onto the dragon's back, right? Those kinds of things. We don't see that here, and so and
mhm.
we don't see it on the DM side, and so you can end up without that, and then your combats can be dry and boring, even though you're perfectly following the rules. Does that make sense?
Mhm. No, it totally makes sense. The final thing of actions in combat is use an object, where you normally interact with an object while doing something else, such as drawing a sword as part of an attack. Essentially, the first one's free. You can do it as a free action. That's not a technical term, as it has been in previous editions. It's just you can just do it. It doesn't cost anything. But then if you want to do something more than that, you would need to use an object to interact with an object. Or if it's not something that's like a sword you're drawing, or something that you would normally do as part of a different action, you need to use your complete action to do it, such as disarming a trap, or something like that. Because when we look at the thief subclass of rogue, right?
Hmm.
I think this is the thief. What's it called?
I think so.
Um, yeah, that's when you have the ability to do these things as a bonus action rather than using your full action to do it. So if it is something that takes a bit of time and effort, you want to make sure that you do make other characters use their full action. Otherwise, you are giving everyone that ability from the rogue subclass
Yeah,
of thief.
yeah. The fast hands ability of the thief.
Yep.
Hmm.
Cool. Wow, I remembered things. This is a banner day. It must be the end of 2022.
You
I
know,
think with that, we should yeah,
I was gonna say we were corrected on something in the last episode. Now I can't remember what it was. I was gonna mention it and say, like, "Oh, thank."
inconceivable.
Yeah, we were wrong about something again, and now I can't remember what it was. But if you check out the last video, there's a conversation about it where we made some leap of logic that was not there. So, but
Yeah.
this episode, I'm pretty sure has been flawless, and I'm excited to do the rest of it later.
Yeah, so we will move on. This being the last episode, as I've said, of 2022, we want to thank lots and lots and lots of people. We want to thank our listeners who continue to give us their attention, and therefore, we being attention seeking, will continue to make a podcast going into the new year. We want to thank our patrons, every single one of you who has contributed to our Patreon. We very much appreciate it. Whether you are a Master of Dungeons supporter or a Master of Realms supporter and getting a shout out in our show notes, or the exclusive Master of the Multiverse patrons, such as John Wilson, Graham Ward, James Walton, Joe Tyler, Krishna Simone Se, Drago Russo, Falcon Neal, Eric Mengi, Adrian Marquez at Post Fiction RPG Audio, Travis Lee, Brian King, Shawn Hurst, Ben Heisler, and Paige Lightman, Andy Edmonds at nerdronomicon.com, Robin Dermy, Darren Chandler, Evil John, Steve Bissonette, and Craig Bailey. Thank you so much for being masters of our multiverse. If you would like to be a patron of the show going into 2023, we would certainly welcome, love, appreciate your support. You can do so by going to patreon.com/masteringdnd. Teos, where are people going to find your greatness on the internet?
My address is no. You can find me at alphastream.org. From there, you can get to all the things I'm doing on Mastodon. I'm AlphaStream at dice.camp. What are you doing, Shawn? Where can we find you?
I am still hanging on Twitter at
Mm-hmm.
Shawn Merwin. The podcast is also still on Twitter at Mastering D&D. But if you prefer Mastodon, you can go to dice.camp to find Mastering D&D there. We also, of course, talk to people on Patreon. Or if you want to see our beautiful mugs, that being our faces, not the stuff we drink coffee and tea from, you can leave comments on the Mastering Dungeons YouTube channel. So, Teos, it has been quite a year. The next time we talk, it will be 2023. And what are we going to do now?
I'm going to hide from the monsters, and then they will have to look up the rules, and that'll take them so long that while they're looking up the rules, I'm going to sneak attack all of them.
And I will help you as long as you can do it at the start of your next turn.
Fantastic.